Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm really, really pleased to welcome you at the EMA premises for this event. And I'm really pleased to see how enthusiastically so many people decided to join us in this reflection and in this exercise, in this project that we are trying to carry out. I just want to take very few minutes to set the scene, and then I leave the floor to you. I think everybody knows, and those who are following us, that we are now committing to proactively publish the clinical data once a market authorization decision has been taken. And we like to do this along with our stakeholders. This project should be done in dialogue with our stakeholders because we understand that many practical and not only practical considerations still need to be addressed and resolved to make this project fly. And today, the Today workshop, of course, represents the very first step to deliver this vision and to make this project fly. What I will say is that the process is irreversible. And I want to say that just to clarify that we are here not to decide if we will publish the clinical data, trial data, but how, and focusing mostly on the future, how to do that. And a few reflections on why. Why I think it's a very important way to build the trust and confidence in the system. I think overall we are taking invariably good and correct decisions rely on good data. So why not to make this public available? The building block of our decision. There is no reason to hide those data. And we have ethical responsibility to the patient. They make their body available to improve the overall knowledge in public health. And so we have some responsibility toward them. And I think the public health the public health will benefit a lot from having independent analysis or reanalysis of data that will broaden the basic knowledge. And in the long run, I'm sure that the scientific progress will benefit from this. Sharing data and complex data, certainly in the long run, will open new horizons. And we have a long story of science that tells that the most of the data, of the knowledge is shared, the most the science will improve and progress. And that will be of benefit for everyone. Just to clarify what we are not doing today, because some confusion may be generated because there is an ongoing legislation about clinical trials. We are not talking about the new legislation. We are only talking about the release of the clinical trial data. We are not talking about all studies. We are talking about the studies that are submitted to our agency. And I encourage not to focus on specific cases, but to focus on the overarching principle and problems that underlying problems that are needed to be addressed to make this possible. We have a chairman. Today, I'd like to introduce you Sir Mark Walport. He's an immunologist, a rheumatologist, and he has been the director of the Wellcome Trust since 2003. What makes me feeling very comfortable and having full trust in him is that he's an immunologist. And that's a shared background attracted me even more the sympathy. Mark Walport has been appointed to become the government chief scientific officer, and he will start this important mandate as April of 2013. He had an impressive list of position, and his experience comes from being involved in a number of the national advisory bodies. I will not take much of the time for that, but definitely he has an experience including some review on behalf of the UK government about the data sharing review in 2009. He has been received his knighthood in 2009 for services in medical reviews. And under his tenure, the Wellcome Trust granted the possibility and also the possibility for the scientists supported by the fund to publish an open magazine, open access magazine, enabling people to get for no payment the data, the availability of the data. And about the Wellcome Trust, is a global charitable foundation, is the second largest private funder of medical research, and is independent both politically and by commercial interest. And with this, I think the floor is yours, and EMA is basically here to listen to you and to make you giving us the opportunity, the information we need. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much indeed, Guido. I don't think I've ever been introduced before as, trust me, I'm an immunologist, but I quite like the idea. So I think this is going to be an exciting and important afternoon. There are a few ground rules. The ground rules are that this is intended to be constructive. It's really important when you speak, and you'll have plenty of opportunity to speak from the floor later on, but there's a button which switches your microphone off. But you do have to hit the button to switch it on. You do have to switch it off at the end, otherwise you'll block other people from speaking. The other thing is that this event is being recorded. It is being live streamed. It is being Twittered, I think. And so you just need to be conscious that you're part of a much bigger event. And I think, as with everything, your contributions will be appreciated by everyone if they don't turn out to be long speeches. So if you can make your comments pithily and constructively, I think that would be appreciated by everyone. We're going to be quite strict on the timekeepers when we get into the panel discussion, because everyone needs a fair go. So they're going to be 5 minutes each. And I'm an absolutely beastly chairman, and we'll stop them in mid-sentence if they exceed their 5 minutes. And I want to kick off now by introducing Giovanni Buttarelli, who's the Assistant European Data Protection Supervisor. And Giovanni, you've been doing that since January 2009. You're appointed by jointly the European Parliament and the Council, and you have an enormous amount of experience in this field. You were Secretary General to the Italian Data Protection Authority since 1997, and you're a member of the Italian judiciary. So I don't think we could start with a better person to tell us about the data protection environment in which context this discussion is happening. So Giovanni, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning to all of you. Let me start with a difficult point, the last one. You mentioned it because it's difficult to ask you to trust on a judge as such. Let's move to substance. Of course, I'm grateful to the agency for the opportunity to contribute to such a debate. And let me start by the conclusions, 2 brief comments, on the basis of which you may better consider some additional remarks I will make. Comment number 1, data protection is not incompatible as such with full transparency. Comment number 2 is that fundamental rights are not to be seen as an obstacle to ensure transparency, but of course we welcome the approach to work on being more precise, notably regarding the purposes to be achieved, modalities of disclosure, and some other details I will perhaps mention in the course of the debate, which are, I think, relevant. So let me now, on the basis of these two general comments, add a few remarks. First of all, the European Data Protection Supervisor, which you know is a supervisory body of the agency, takes note of the announced strategic decision to improve transparency of clinical trial data. We welcome the proactive approach to identify key issues where transparency may be increased. And I think that the initiative as such is in line with the EDPS policy on public access to documents. So we appreciate also that we are consulted in an early stage. We appreciate the intention to ensure and achieve full compliance with the existing European Union data protection rules. So we assume that the agency is aimed at ensuring and guaranteeing a robust and sound protection of personal data, while at the same time increasing the transparency of your activities. I think that any decision taken here, EU level, will also influence any decentralized procedure and responsibility at national level. Let me focus my today's contribution only on the respect of data protection rules, although I assume that other policy issues and conflicting positions are to be considered and perhaps are also relevant for data protection as well. So I also noted from the background documents that there is an assumption that the data we are considering today are not considered commercially confidential as such. And personally speaking, I share this viewpoint. But compliance with data protection rules will depend to a large extent on the purposes to be achieved by a publication, by a disclosure. So if we have a look to the documents, again, background documents, we see that what is in the air is the intention to enable access to full data sets to interested parties, perhaps, or to make them publicly available, including the research community. But in this respect, it's crucial to determine what is covered by notion of public interest. So we understand the rise in the amount of requests to make technically data publicly available, and also the increase in requests of access to documents. But it's not entirely clear to us at this stage the notion in the public interest. So a first clarification would be useful. Secondly, there are no doubts about the existence of personal data in addition to other types of information available in the publication of the results of clinical trials. I will come back to this point perhaps in the framework of the debate, coming back to a 2010 position from the Ombudsman. We encourage the agency, as well as any other stakeholder in this area, to identify the different and select the different categories of data subjects, employees, perhaps, clinical investigators, and patients. Why? Because different rules may be applied to each category. Our position, and we have been consulted by the agency a few months ago, is that as a general rule, sensitive data about patients, individual patients involved in clinical trials, may neither be disclosed nor published as a rule. And I appreciated a lot a contribution from Mr. Rasi and Mr. Heichler in a background document where they also mention the issue of identifiable people affected by ultra-rare diseases. So perhaps the identification of clinical investigators may be relevant in the context of, for instance, a conflict of interest, or perhaps administrative investigations. We may have a cautious approach with regard to employees of pharmaceutical companies, but perhaps not a strict vision. But we encourage a different approach for individuals involved, although they are not mentioned name by name, but perhaps they are simply identified by a code. In our viewpoint, these are identifiable people, although the last piece of information is not available for those applying for transparency. So, in conclusion, there is no equal protection for all data subjects, no one size for all. Finally, I would like to encourage further discussions and, of course, clarity as concerns the modalities of publication. I noted that we frequently speak about publicly available documents. Well, publicly available document by a legal viewpoint means to everybody, while the notion of access to public public documents means to release a document to interested parties only. So the modalities under which this happens are in principle neutral. You may ensure access to selected people only via a platform by giving a password. You may disclose documents in a website, but crucial is to identify who is entitled to have access and when. And this is also relevant in terms of controllership and in terms of competence. We understand that the agency is in charge of playing a role as a distinguished advice, a crucial advice for the final step, an authorization by DG Sanco. So, of course, if the agency is interested by a request of access to public documents, there is no doubt about the need to deal with such a request. But if you are working in a perspective to make the documents publicly available to everybody, then the reflection is to be made with regard to the competent body. Is simply the agency the one competent? So one body which is competent for one piece of a complex procedure, or should we have an analysis by also involving the body in charge of the final decision? It's also relevant to have an analysis about tools to be used. For instance, if you are going to disclose documents in a website, what about external and internal search engines in terms of having a look? So I think I'm at the end of my first contribution, and I'm grateful for the opportunity you give us.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. And I think that already sets a set of challenges and questions, but we'll come back to all of that in the panel discussion. So next I want to introduce Gerhard Grill, who is representing the European Ombudsman representative. And there's no doubt that the lawyers outnumber the doctors in the presentations in this first part. So Gerhard studied law at Munich originally, and you were in the Directorate General Competition of the European Commission in Brussels in the late 1990s. You've been in the Office of the European Ombudsman at Strasbourg since April 1999 and were appointed head of unit and director in 2011. And so I think I've been asked if the speakers would come and speak here. That way I think you'll be best filmed. So I'll swap places with you now and let you have your few minutes.
Thank you very much. Yes, I've been asked by the European Ombudsman, Mr. Nikiforos Diamandouros, to represent him here. Mr. Diamandouros is unfortunately not able to come himself, and I count myself lucky of having been invited, even though I'm not an immunologist or another doctor. I'm just a lawyer. Let me start with a few remarks which probably will be will bring nothing new to you, which nevertheless set the background to what I'm going to say. The Treaty of Lisbon has extended the right to public access to documents to all the institutions, bodies, etc. of the European Union, including the Medicines Agency. And as you know, the relevant rules are laid down in Regulation 1049/2001 on public access to Parliament, Council and Commission documents and other legal acts, including EMA's rules implementing Regulation 1049/2001 as regards EMA documents. The European Ombudsman has the mandate to examine complaints about maladministration in the behavior of the EU institutions, bodies, agencies, and offices. Put differently, he has to try and ensure that these EU bodies comply with principles of good administration in their activities. And an important sector of the Ombudsman's work concerns transparency in general and access to documents issues in particular. This is, in fact, an ever-increasing part of the Ombudsman's work. When dealing with such matters, the Ombudsman, of course, follows the principles that are laid down in the relevant acts, Regulation 1049/2001 in particular, and the case law of the European courts. And you know that there are three main principles. First, that the widest possible access should be given to such documents. Second, that the exceptions to the right of access should be interpreted strictly. And third, the principle that an institution or body wishing to rely on an exception has to provide adequate reasons for its position. In 2007, the Ombudsman received a complaint about a refusal to grant access to documents in the possession of EMA. So the case already has been alluded to. And the Ombudsman therefore had the opportunity to take position as regards the issue of access to clinical trial data. In that case, EMA, in the course of a lengthy inquiry, put forward basically four arguments. The first one was based on the TRIPS agreement and was later not continued and therefore did not need to be assessed by the Ombudsman in his final decision. And the second one concerns the possibly disproportionate effort needed to prepare documents for publication and disclosure. The Ombudsman did not think that this was an insurmountable problem. Perhaps to mention at this stage that I, at that time, together with a colleague, inspected the relevant documents at EMA and was impressed by the sheer number of documents and pages. We were literally looking at thousands of pages. The third argument put forward by EMA at that time concerned data protection issues, and I will forbear to express any views here after we've already heard from the Deputy European Data Protection Supervisor. Let me therefore concentrate on the fourth and last argument put forward by EMA in that case, and this argument was based on the commercial interests exception. The relevant rules provide that access is to be refused where disclosure would undermine the protection of, inter alia, commercial interests of a natural or legal person, including intellectual property, unless there's an overriding public interest in disclosure. Having examined the individual arguments put forward by EMA to support its view that this exception applied in the present case, as regards clinical trial data, the Ombudsman considered that EMA had not established that such documents fell within the scope of the commercial interests exception. And secondly, that even if one were to assume that these documents were covered by the exception, EMA had not shown that giving access to these documents would specifically and actually undermine commercial interests. That, of course, is a reflection of the case law of the European courts, which foresees that in order for such an exception to apply, the effect on the interests protected must be specific and actual. The Ombudsman therefore called on EMA to grant the complainants access to the relevant documents or to provide a convincing explanation as to why such access should not be given. In its reaction to this recommendation, EMA informed the Ombudsman that it had decided to grant access to these documents, and the Ombudsman therefore was able to close the case since EMA had accepted his recommendation. This case concerned a request for access, and there are numerous requests for access, not only at the agency, but elsewhere as well. And seen against this background, EMA's intention to adopt a proactive approach as to how to deal with the issue of access to documents in this field is clearly commendable. The decision that EMA envisages to take in this respect must obviously be in conformity with all the relevant rules. EMA therefore needs to make sure that the relevant documents or data are not covered by any of the exceptions that could be applied, or where this is applicable, that the public interest outweighs the interest protected by these exceptions. As I already mentioned, in his decision on the case that I presented to you, the Ombudsman has set out his views on the matter. However, it cannot be excluded, of course, that there are other arguments that could be put forward. In the inquiry on the complaint I mentioned, the Ombudsman, of course, was limiting himself to assessing the arguments that had been put forward. Last remark, and as already mentioned by Mr. Buttarelli, there is, of course, a clear need to clarify the modalities of granting access to this data. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that. So I think we've had an extremely good introduction to the sort of historical background to this. And I think we've heard two extremely important things. Firstly, from on the data protection side, that data protection is not incompatible with transparency. And secondly, we've heard a nice piece of sort of historical evolution, which is that the meeting we got to, if you like, arrived at with the EMA putting up all the reasons that it couldn't be transparent to the Ombudsman and having those comprehensively rejected. And it's clearly to everyone's credit that we're now here, and this is the moment at which I think we get into the stakeholder consultation, because with those introductory remarks, now is the opportunity to hand over to a group of splendid individuals who represent different parts of different sectors. So we've got, and I'll introduce them in a little more detail in a second, we've got Peter Gøtzsche from academia and from the Cochrane collaboration. From the pharmaceutical industry, we've got Susan Forder and Neil Weir. From the world of journalism and publishing, we've got Ben Goldacre and Virginia Barbour. And from, of course, in many ways, the people that matter the most, which is all of us as patients. We have a patient voice in François Huyes. So very briefly, because the introductions could use all the time, Peter Gøtzsche, I think importantly, co-founded the Cochrane collaboration in 1993. And I don't think the Cochrane collaboration needs much introduction to the people in this room. What Cochrane does is it takes all of the evidence from clinical trials in a very systematic way, both published and unpublished material, and assembles it to provide, as it were, the best evidence on the treatment of conditions. And there can be no more important activity than that. Next to Peter is Susan Forder. Susan trained as a pharmacist, did a PhD in neuropharmacology, and 17 years ago, you joined the Lilly European Regulatory Group and is responsible for all regulatory aspects of Lilly's current and future products outside the United States. And you're chair of the European Federation on Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations Scientific, Regulatory, Manufacturing and Policy Committee. So you're very well placed to talk about this. Neil Weir, who's sitting next to Susan, is standing in for Peter Anderson, and Neil is head of discovery at UCB. And prior to that, Neil was head of research at Celtech. And again, your important role in EFPIA, you're a member of the EFPIA Research Directors Group. Sitting next to Neil is Ben Goldacre, who is a doctor, academic, writer, and broadcaster. I suspect, again, is very well known to most people in this room. I think your day job is that you're a research fellow in epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but you're well known for your many writings on bad science, and you've recently written a very provocative book entitled, I think, Bad Pharma, and people can debate whether that's the case or not, and I'm sure a lot of people have them. Next to Ben is Virginia Barbour, who was one of the co-founding editors, or the founding co-editors of PLOS Medicine, the Public Library of Science Medicine. You were the journal's first chief editor in 2008, and you're chair of the Committee on Publication Ethics. Finally, we have Francois Huyes, who, it says at the bottom of my briefing, Francois is also a patient. And you work at the European Organization for Rare Diseases, EURORDIS, and a special emphasis of your work has been patients' rights advocacy. You've chaired the European Community Advisory Board, and you've been involved in discussions with sponsors of many clinical trials. So I hope you all agree we couldn't have a better panel to come at this from all sorts of different perspectives. We're going to go in the order that the people are seated, so we'll start with Peter. And this is where the 5-minute timekeeping rule becomes strict. So you have 5 minutes starting now. Peter.
Thank you very much. It's unbelievable we have come to this place so relatively quickly. And I would like to thank both Hans-Georg Eichler and Guido Rassi for being so firm that there is no way back. We are now only discussing practicalities. That makes my introduction very easy. And I can tell you, I have a car that is 14 years old, and every second year it is going to be inspected. And imagine if I next year come up with 20 meters of paper and tell the inspectors, I have done all the testing myself, I didn't bring my car, you're just going to read my papers. They would think I'm crazy. So why have we arranged a system that is so crazy that industry is its own judge? It makes trials, it analyzes them, it interprets them, and many times introduces bias in data analysis. And if that is not enough, they won't get published. So how could we accept a system like that with such an immense conflict of interest? The difference between an honest data analysis and a less honest data analysis can be worth billions on the world market. But patients don't participate in trials to benefit the shareholders of the sponsoring company. They participate to benefit science and future patients. So I'm very happy that we have now reached the stage that there is no way back. We will get access to the results and to the raw data so that everybody can analyze them. And that makes me say a couple of things to the data protection supervisor. We can discuss this later, but you said, well, what is the public interest in this? Well, let me just tell you that I have gone through a lot of literature the last 6 months, which has taught me that the third biggest cause of death in the United States is drugs. After heart disease and cancer, drugs come in third. So many people die on drugs every year. And this is partly because we don't know what the harms are. So there is a huge public interest in getting access to these data. And we can also help the EMA by doing its job. Because, for example, when I asked for access to 3 antidepressant drugs at the Swedish Drug Agency, I was told, oh yes, you can get access. We have 70 meters of paper, not 17, but 70 meters of paper in a mountain cave somewhere in Sweden, and you are welcome to come and look at it, and we can even transport it to Uppsala, so you don't need to sit in the mountain cave. That would take us 30 years. So it tells you something about that we need easy access in PDFs, and we need the data in statistical programs so we can work with them. The days of secrecy are gone. And it has always been bizarre to me how the drug industry could say that they own the data. I have learned from the European Ombudsman and others that this isn't really the case. Data provided by patients belong to all of us. They are public knowledge. Two more things. What about the clinical investigator names? I can't see anything needs to be redacted from EMA reports. You must be accountable if you're a clinical investigator collaborating with a drug company. Why can't we know what these names are? Of course, we must see them. We must see everything. There is nothing that needs to be hidden. And the last thing, who could get access to the data? Please, everybody. Sometimes it's investigative journalists that reveal terribly interesting things. No formal qualifications, nothing. We can ask, is there a protocol for this study? And if not, and if it's not pre-registered somewhere, we will not have so much confidence in what people find out. But really, please, open access to everybody. No qualifications, no delays, just put everything out on a public website. Thanks.
Well done, just in time. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Susan Ford is next.
Yeah, no, Neil is.
Oh, Neil's going next, okay.
Okay, no.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Sir Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd very much like to thank the EMA for hosting this event and providing the opportunity to hear and consider these views. I absolutely agree with Peter, and I hope this will come out in the discussion that our patients take part in the studies that we are involved in for the good of patients, and that's absolutely our intention as well. As Sir Mark mentioned, I'm standing in this afternoon for Peter Anderson, and in that respect, I'm representing the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries, and Peter is the chair of the Research Directors Group for the RDG within FPA. And I hope if in any way I can convey the energy and enthusiasm that Peter brings to that Research Directors Group, and in particular the collaborative research that's gone on supporting the IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, then I'll have done a good job. So I'm going to, I was briefed by Peter this morning. Unfortunately, Peter was unable to make it this morning. And I'm just going to give you a perspective of the comments he would like to make. But also I'd like to just share that, you know, Peter comes at this, as many of us do, from having done discovery in academia in the first instance and then converting into industry, because he made a judgment, as many of us did, that might be for him the best opportunity to actually convert that great science into benefit for patients. And of course, other people will make different decisions, and of course we collectively need everyone to contribute that insight to science. But I know that for Peter, it's been one of his proudest moments to actually see some of that science translate through to benefit into patients. And also, perhaps best personified by the sort of work that Peter has done in IMI, it is our collective view that we need to find a better way of doing this. And we need to continue to improve and develop our ability to collaborate and communicate. Because actually I think that's where we're going to be able to translate the great new science that's being done collectively in industry and academia, and also clearly with the involvement of patient groups into the new treatments of the future. And a key component of this, I think we recognized, is in the area of stratified medicine or personalized medicine. And this is a thing that Peter and I are working on very much to bring a new understanding, perhaps even moving towards a molecular classification of disease. And through that sort of greater stratification of patient groups, to understand more about the mechanism, to actually access some of these so far inaccessible mechanisms that actually will bring greater benefit, where we actually have to be much better at understanding the subgroup of patients that will benefit. And by doing so, tailor these treatments to the patients who will benefit, better for society, and clearly also better for patients, because actually we'll only be treating those that stand to benefit. Now, we also recognize that to get there, this again is a collaboration between many groups, including patient organizations. And it will actually require us to understand much better how to actually share data, particularly as we believe we actually move to the point where genetic information is tremendously important. We'll have to address that sort of understanding. So what needs to be done to achieve this? New ways of working together, industry and industry working together, industry and stakeholders working together, and better communication, better understanding and sharing of data. One solution I mentioned is exemplified by the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is a €2 billion collaboration between the pharmaceutical industries, many stakeholders, including patient groups, academia, small industry groups, and has been running for 4 years and is so far has been tremendously successful in sharing understanding, because I think we recognize that inventions are generally not made by individual experts, but actually they're often made by people coming together and forming these ideas. And clearly we recognize that to do that, we need to share ideas. I just noticed I've got 1 minute left. So, learnings from IMI from Peter. We will be talking about high technology and very, very expensive type work to be done. Therefore, we recognize that we need to find a balance when data it is appropriate to share and when data it is not appropriate to share. And we need to be very precise about that when we start collaborations, because our view is that we will not bring the benefit to patients unless we are able to maintain a system whereby the companies and other groups that are involving this can actually ensure they continue to do this. And of course, in the context of companies, that's actually to ensure that we actually derive the appropriate commercial return from our ideas. So, in conclusion, importance of IP and commercial confidential information we recognize, and we recognize we've got to be very precise about making those judgments. We generally feel a better involvement in patients is critical to our task going forward. And we believe we will only be able to do this, particularly sharing patient data, if we apply the appropriate stringency in communication of data. So I should finish there.
Okay, thank you much indeed. Susan.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be here and have this opportunity. So I'd like to follow on from what my colleague was talking about and say that it is, of course, extremely important for us to make sure that all the stakeholders are involved so that we can together find solutions which are beneficial to all of those involved, and in particular, transparency to make best use, safe and efficacious use for patients. And we want, as part of FPIA, to seek to ensure that appropriate access to clinical data information, and especially to legitimate scientific researchers. So this is a very sensitive issue, and what we would ask in particular that this be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Specifically, what is the nature of the product, what are the nature of the data that you're presenting, and where is it in its life cycle, and what method of release is hereby being proposed. We particularly ask that there be consideration for protection of intellectual property rights and also clearly for personalized data. And we very much want to do that to maintain a viable research-based economy for the pharmaceutical industry in Europe. We have welcomed as FPIA the EMA-HMA initiative to devise a common approach to what data will be released, and we think that certainly this consistency will help as far as duplicative requests are concerned, and hopefully would ease the burden. Now, specifically, I have 4 points to make on behalf of FPIA. Is that all of the requests that are made and all of the release of information that is made should take into account the international and the EU rules on commercially confidential information and protected personal data. The second thing is, and this is something that we earnestly plead, is that before this information are released, is that the EMA should discuss with the marketing authorization holder what elements that have asked to be released could be classed as commercially confidential or personalized protected data, and therefore we would have a chance to discuss with them what can and shouldn't be released. Thirdly, we are not in favour of the release of information from withdrawn or negative opinion products, because we think that that somehow can damage the future commercial interests of that product should you choose to resubmit it with additional data or submit it in jurisdictions outside of the European Union. And the last couple of points that I wanted to make is that, as you know, pharmaceutical companies do already register the information on ongoing trials. They publish information on the completed trials. And as of January 2013, where they will have the additional responsibility within the European Union also to publish, in addition to the already existing website, onto UDRA-CT. So, to that end, we will continue to work with the EMA and other stakeholders. We hope to develop an appropriate and balanced approach to fostering transparency while protecting the legitimate interests of sponsors and promoting innovation. And I hope that in working together, we will find a good solution towards what I would call responsible transparency. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much. That was well within time, so well done. Ben Geldecker.
Thank you. I should begin by saying it's true, I have a foot in two camps. I'm a doctor and an academic. I've done my time with Stata, but I'm also somebody who speaks about science to the public. And I believe passionately in public engagement because I believe that the public are wise. There are many publics. And when I've spoken about the problems in medicine very broadly, not just the pharmaceutical industry, that's because I believe that there are people out there who have an enormous amount to contribute, people with knowledge about the law, about policy, about lobbying, and about coding. And I think if we share our ongoing problems with them by engaging with the public, they're very likely to come up with valuable solutions for us, which we can all use. I'd like to just set out a few basic principles. We need many eyes on difficult problems like efficacy and safety. The problems with drugs like Vioxx, rosiglitazone and Tamiflu were not spotted by regulators. And that's not because regulators are stupid, in fact, quite the opposite. But it's because these problems are very, very difficult and they benefit from many eyes. That's why I think we need to ensure that we have all information from all trials, both past and present, on all drugs in current use, available to all doctors and patients and academics so that they can make informed decisions about whether treatments work or don't and about the relative benefits of those treatments. And I think we need to address this with a sense of urgency, which is why it's great to hear from both the Ombudsman and others that that patient safety should take precedent over commercial rights or needs of companies. On the specific question of data, I think it's very important that we meet all requests for individual patient data promptly. I think ideally this data should be placed and publicly available. If it has to be in a cut down form, then so be it. And we should be realistic that many of these requests for data will come from competitors as well as from independent academics. And in some respects, that's reasonable and good and to be hoped for. There are issues of patient confidentiality with very rich data sets, and it's important to be proportionate about the benefits and the risks here. There are mostly modest amounts of data in these data sets, and for context, for example, the GP research database, now rebranded as CPRD, which I work on in my day job, contains very, very rich data. It's essentially 3 million patients' full health records, and we've made a trade-off there that is valuable information to have and to share for the benefit of all. And this is something that has to be borne in mind whenever we're discussing sharing data. If a full data set contains an enormous amount of rich confidential information and ends up being withheld, I think there are certain principles which it's very important to have locked down early on. Firstly, we need to have a public record of all requests and all objections from data holders and all adjudications. We also have to recognise that there may well be stupid analyses. People may well engage in stupid data dredging. And so be it. There is a lot of very stupid research. At the very least, as Peter says, we can say that secondary analyses that haven't been carefully described before they're done in protocol form with plenty of information about their analytic strategy can be discounted. And I don't think it would also be unreasonable to ask people to publicly post protocols and analysis plans beforehand. But before we impose these very high standards, we should recognise that that's not the case for trialists' own analyses today. And this is a serious problem. There's not enough detail in trial registries. We don't have the full protocol, we don't have the full analytic strategy, and the new European Clinical Trials Regulation currently does very little to fix this problem. So when I ran into Hans-Georg Eichler, when he very candidly came to our meeting in the European Parliament last week on the Clinical Trials Regulation and problems in it, he said I should feel free to speak more widely about problems beyond simply individual patient data sharing. So I think there's a very important issue, which is We need to make a proper register. The current EU clinical trials register is missing thousands and thousands of trials. That's not adequately publicly disclosed by the European Medicines Agency. It doesn't include any phase 1 trials, which is a serious problem, and we need an ongoing public audit of what's missing. But I think we also need to demand that results are posted there within 1 year of completion. We know that clinicaltrials.gov requested that, and we know that that was ignored. We know that only 1 in 5 trials have met that requirement, and because of an absence of public audit and an absence of structured data, we didn't know that that was a problem until 5 years after the register was made law. And I think we should also feel free and enthusiastic about demanding that all manufacturers disclose the existence of all trials on all uses of all drugs in current use, regardless of whether they are for on-license or off-license use, and regardless of how long those drugs have been on the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Virginia Barbour.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks very much. I just want to say that when I was preparing to speak, I got input from a number of journal editors and academics, so I'm attempting to represent a lot of views here. All the good ideas were theirs, all the mistakes are mine, as usual. So I think it's great that we've moved beyond discussing whether the data that support an drug application should be publicly available at the time of licensing. I think that's a phenomenal achievement. So what we are here to do, I think, is to, as Dr. Eichler and colleagues said in a paper that published in PLOS Medicine earlier this year, we're here to debate the terms of engagement. So, what do we want as journal editors and publishers? We want the research we publish to be reliable and reproducible. Timely and efficient data release helps that. But publishing is obviously just one part of a larger rationale for the availability of data, one part of which I'd specifically highlight is to combat the suppression of research results, which we know is a substantial problem in the medical literature at the moment. So to begin with, I think we have to recognise this can't be an initiative coming from one direction. It has to have the backing of all parties, which is why I think the representation in this room is fantastic. We need funders, regulators, editors, trialists, both the commercial and academic communities, all of which have to have a commitment to move this forward. We need practical, political, financial commitments made. The good news is that we couldn't have been having this conversation 10 years ago. We can have it now because we've got the tools, we've got the technologies, the legal frameworks in the form of licenses to make this happen. So I'm going to group the issues that I think are important into 3 headings: transparency, reproducibility, and practicality. So what about transparency? So the short-term objective, I think, is that data that support a successful application should be publicly available at the time of licensing, and that should be true for currently approved drugs as well. I think longer term, we want to move for data for unsuccessful applications to be made available. If we do decide that data requests go through a vetting procedure before release, there needs to be a clear process for that, and all of these requests must be logged, and a process put in place to follow up the results that result from this data release. And there has to be a mechanism in place to enforce compliant data release and also some sort of independent verification that all the data are supplied. I think that's something we've seen in the past. So about reproducibility, I think there are 2 key issues. The data and the analysis that arise from them must be made available in such a way that others can reproduce the work that comes out of them. So a critical issue is going to be the license that the data are sent out under. There must be public domain, Creative Commons CC0 licenses applied to these data so they can be properly reused. And there should, I think, be a requirement that analyses that are published as a result of this are also published under Creative Commons attribution licenses, which maximise sharing of the data themselves. It would be absolutely insane if data were allowed to be published under restrictive licenses. So the biggest issue, I think, are the practical issues, and I think that's here what we can hopefully come up with to some extent. The format of the data themselves will be critical. We don't want, 10-metre piles high of documents sitting in a Norwegian cave. They have to be easily available. They have to be in data that can be shared. We need really good metadata so that we can enhance usability. The data sets need to be persistently identified in such a way that they can be linked to protocols, publications, trial registries, patents, wherever these data were produced. EMA needs to collaborate, I think, on standards in this area, work with other regulators. We clearly need adoption of anonymisation standards in particular, and we discussed that came up earlier. We need to decide practically whether or not EMA is going to come up with their own repository or a web portal, or whether they're going to use one that's currently involved. In either way, I would absolutely urge that this registry is independent. We need funding for this, and we must also have incentives. So I'm going to finish by saying two things. One is that now that we've agreed this, I would urge the EMA not to allow this initiative to get mired in endless negotiations. It needs to work swiftly to make it a reality with commitments, timeline, and deadlines. The interests of the people in this room reflect that interest. So here's one thought for how we can make this happen. There's enough people, there's enough expertise in this room that, frankly, if we locked the doors now and gave us 48 hours, I actually think we could sort it out. So we need to do something like that. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we're not going to lock the doors for 48 hours. Many people will be relieved to hear. So, Francois, you.
Thank you. 5 minutes. I feel my body is already producing antibodies against the timekeepers, I'm afraid. Because we patients, we certainly acknowledge that the interest of having a second look at the data submitted for analysis of clinical trials. We have the example of the FDA hearings, where it is absolutely excellent to have the views of the company and the counter expertise of the FDA statisticians, and then the expert panel discussing. This is really where we understand the results of the trial. We also would like to give a possibility for those who are searching for new products in different indications to have access to data, including for products that did not make it to the market. The first set of risks that explain why we are here today is the risk regarding data privacy. There are different situations because there are different diseases. In rare disease, for example, and I was myself surprised when I first started in rare diseases, there are parents who have children who live and die with a rare disease, and at the end of their lives, the parents have no children anymore, and they think, well, if at least the tissue could have been collected in biobanks and all the data collected for a future research team to have access to all of these for other children to benefit from that research, even if it is to the detriment of data privacy and data protection, they are eager to share their data with whoever is interested because there are so few people interested. In other diseases, like HIV and AIDS, for example, it's more or less the opposite, where patients hate to have, when they are on a sick leave, a certificate signed by an infectious department service of the hospital where they are treated, because then anybody can guess that they have HIV and AIDS. The proposals to have centers of expertise for HIV and AIDS was even turned down by patient organizations who really thought that what matters first is to protect the privacy of the patients, and even if it means not to enter a clinical trial or not to be treated in a center. As an illustration, the French public database run by the Ministry of Health, DMI2, is an illustration. It is supposed to contain all the data, well, many data from all patients with HIV and AIDS in France. And they conducted an analysis of whose patients are not in the database. And two groups came first. First, all people who don't have legal documents because of the fear to be identified and to have to go to the police. And the first group, in fact, were professionals working in computer science because they did not trust the system to protect their privacy. That was done in the 90s. Maybe safety of this database still has improved, but that was, I think, an interesting element. However, there are risks that, to our opinion, are greater than data protection breach. There is nothing worse from the communication point of view when different authorities or official circles communicate completely diverging information to the public. Recently, a journalist specialized in the field of genetically modified organisms wrote an article saying that he's giving up. He can no longer analyze what is being published because as soon as you publish a study, the data are used by others who will use a different analytic method, sometimes not at all appropriate. They will disseminate different results, and they will say this other study was not independent from this industry, or is, and we use a different method. the public cannot distinguish which methods are accurate. All they hear is one is independent, the other is not, and this is it, and this has been creating confusion. And we don't want to end up in this situation with clinical trials. The patients are weighing the risk, the benefits and risk when entering into clinical trials. I think if the data have to be shared with third parties, then it has to be clearly stated in the consent form, even if the third parties in questions are not known at the time of consent. And this risk is not theoretical. I remember the Concorde trial, which was run both by MRC and ANRS, where different press releases from different members of the of the steering committee of the trial published different results, and the media published even different analysis of the results. For the 1,739 participants in the trial, this was confusing. This was really harming the benefit of participating in a clinical trial, and we can still avoid this. So what we will recommend to conclude, a bit like what the agency has done for the access to eudravigilance data, is that any third party interested to use the patient data from a specific clinical trial should request access to the data to the EMA. And with this request, the third party should explain the purpose and the proposed analytic method, should explain how it protects data privacy, and the third party should disclose any interest, should demonstrate having the necessary expertise and qualification to conduct the proposed analysis, and maybe first disclose their results with the EMA before going public, and failures to do so could lead the third party in questions to be on a blacklist, and a probation period maybe of 3 to 5 years could be run. To conclude, even if I sound a bit conservative, it's, I think, to be provocative and protective for the patient's interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Okay, so can I start by thanking all of the panelists for obeying the rules very strictly and I think being very clear. So the plan now is to have a discussion amongst the panel for a few minutes, and then we will bring in the audience. I've got a small number of questions from outside and will depend how we get on within the room. But I just want to remind people again of the scope of today's workshop. So the EMA has said we're committed to proactive publication of clinical trial data once a marketing authorization decision has been taken. And just for clarity, Guido, that applies either way, doesn't it? So either accepted or rejected. That's the first thing. And we're not here today to decide if we publish clinical trial data, but how. And I think the other thing to say is that although Ben brought up some issues about the Clinical Trials Directive, past trials, clinical trial registers, that's not actually what today's meeting is about. They're all important issues, but that's not what today is about. So I want us to focus on the actual topic. So just to kick off the discussion, there have clearly been, if you like, some battle lines drawn up, but maybe I shouldn't use such a military metaphor. But let me come back to Neil, because actually, in some senses, Susan set out the position pretty clearly. Neil, you've heard the presentation from the panelists who want, some of them, effectively complete openness. And if bad analyses happen, well, that's the risk of science, as it were. So what's your response, Neil, to the discussion that you've heard?
So I think that clearly I would have more concern if bad analysis happens. I think it's not just the potential for bad analysis, and I think Francois explained very elegantly the potential impact broadly. I think there is, and I hope I'm keeping on the topic here, Sir Mark. It's extremely expensive to collect a lot of this data, and there will be data which from time to time that we believe is not appropriate to share, and that's either because it's not potentially going to be interrogated on the basis of starting with a specific scientific hypothesis, or potentially because there's further, correctly, in the discussion we're having, correctly there are further insights to be generated from it. And we actually feel that it's appropriate for the if indeed it is the industry who've actually invested very significantly to collect that data, to have the opportunity to mine that data themselves. in the first instance.
Is there any suggestion that there's data there's going to be transparency about that isn't submitted as part of the market authorization, for clarity there? Do you want to respond on that? The implication is that there's a searching for transparency about information that may not have been submitted as part of the market authorization. That's not what's proposed, is it? Let me try it again. There's a dossier that's submitted to the EMA on the basis of which you make a decision. Yes. In terms of the transparency you're talking about the transparency of that information. You're not talking about anything over and above that. So doesn't that come back to you, Neil? There's nothing that's being asked for transparency that you haven't already submitted. Okay, Sue, why didn't you come in on that?
Well, I'm a bit confused by the question. So as far as our understanding of the legislation is, when you submit a dossier, you must submit all the information as required by the guidelines. And that includes both for the indication that you're looking for, and you will also submit data on other indications, be they, it might be an ongoing study, but you will notify that you have that study ongoing. So what we are saying is that, for instance, if you have ongoing studies for another indication, you may be applying, for instance, for a use patent. You can imagine that at that stage, it's potentially damaging for the company if those data were to be released, because you would then not be granted your use patent.
Right. Is there any response from EMA on that, or should we just carry on the discussion in the panel?
Please carry on. I think we said we'll listen.
Yeah.
And
okay. So let's keep the debate going. Peter, do you want to come back on what you've heard? I mean, essentially, there are two slightly diverging positions that are being presented. Have an argument with each other.
Yes, the argument about bad analysis is a bit amusing, because the situation can't be much worse than it is today. That the only people who have seen all the data are people working in the company that is going to earn a lot of money on these products. So it can only be better that more eyes, as Ben Goldacre said, can look at the same data. So don't be worried about this. The current situation is unbearable.
Okay, who wants to come in?
So to respond to that, Peter, I think it's not just people in the company that have had access to the data. In my experience, very often, in fact, almost always, companies will actually reach out to really tap into who we see as the real experts, clinical experts in the field, to help us in interpreting the data.
Okay, Peter.
We have actually studied this very carefully and published about it. Others have done the same. It is like this, that clinical investigators are never allowed to see all the data. If they ask for the raw data, they are turned down every time. I have never heard about this being the case. So please don't fool us.
Okay, I don't want to get too stuck on this as a sole topic. So we were throwing up some challenges at the beginning. And on the data protection, we were throwing up the question of what is in the public interest. So let's get different views of what is in the public interest in terms of disclosure. Who wants to have a first go at that? Francois, why didn't you have a first go? You are, in a sense, the public with respect to this.
We have sympathy with having different teams looking at the data with different angles. But when you enter a clinical trial and you trust the team of the clinical trial, you need to know, and you won't know, if you don't know in advance who will have a second look, then there is an ethical problem here. I want to know exactly what the data and how the data will be used. So I think the risk is not a bad analysis. The risk is more, we would feel safer if those who do this secondary analysis or who have another look on the data are clearly identified and that they have the skills and that they come with the method to analyze the data. And maybe an independent body that could be different from EMA would review this request and grant access to the data or not, depending on the soundness and other skills that these other parties may have. I think this way we would feel safer and better protected.
Okay. Virginia, you want to come in?
Yeah, so if I can come back on 2 points that relate to that. So the first one is the concern that there is, if you enter into a trial and your data are entered into it and you don't know what's going to happen with it. I think that's actually a flaw of current current consent forms. There is a way to solve this. We've solved it, for example, in case reports in open access journals, in fact, in medical journals, where, for example, the BMJ led the way in coming up with very explicit consent forms for publication of case reports. You can do this. You can tell people very early on what you are expecting, what will happen to the data when they enter into a clinical trial, and then it's up to them to decide when they do what they do. So I think that can be solved up front. The second thing is, though, I have quite a lot of nervousness with the idea that you have to pre-specify who will look at data after it's made available. This is the classical thing about when you have, for example, why open access has been so successful. You have no idea what people will do with the data unless you release it out to large numbers of people. It's much better to have many eyes on data than a few eyes, and I would be very nervous about the idea of trying to, even if one could reasonably pre-specify who would look at the data set.
Okay, Ben?
Francoise raises the idea that participants place special trust in trialists. And I think that's true, but I think that trust is very often misplaced. The main analyses conducted by the trialists themselves are often flawed. We know that people very commonly, for example, switch their primary outcome between protocol and analysis without even adequately declaring that. And we know that the results of clinical trials are often not disclosed to doctors and patients. So I think it's important to be clear, firstly, that any special bond of trust between participant and trialist may actually be very seriously misplaced. And secondly, just on the issue that we should prospectively require that people consent before we start sharing clinical trial data, whatever is decided or discussed about that, whatever position anybody comes to on that, we have to recognise the need to be proportionate here. And if we make that requirement, then that means we will never be able to have any access to clinical trial data for any trial that has already been conducted. So we would never be able to have access to individual patient data on Vioxx or any of the drugs that are currently on the market, because we would only be starting from the trials which are recruiting, not even reporting, but recruiting now. So that would mean that we wouldn't have access to clinical trial data until perhaps maybe 5 years from now. And I think we have to be very, very cautious about signing up to that notion, because that would mean delaying transparency for at least 5 years and restricting it only to trials which complete from several years from now.
Giovanni.
Oh, thanks. When we say need for more clarity about the notion of public interest, we do not challenge the need to ensure openness. So no doubts, and we share most and perhaps all of the concerns about the need to, not only involve interested parties and the scientific research community, but a wider public. Problem is, clarity is crucial with the relevant, also with regard to the modalities to be chosen. It was said one thing is to ensure access to interested parties only, and one thing is, and I saw a large majority of orientation on that, to ensure a publicly available access, because this is also relevant in terms of exercise of data subjects' rights. Which are provided by law, by the data protection law. One thing is to have the agency dealing with the legal obligation, including those related to ensure access to public documents. One thing is to simply act in the public interest. And secondly, I see more than one public interest if I have a look to what you said. So clarity is crucial to have a robust approach in terms of openness, in terms of prior information to the relevant people, And finally, also in terms of further use of data for those having access to the same information. An additional footnote concerning the choice to be made, access to interested parties only, data publicly available. There are a lot of court cases dealing with access by journalists. And there is now a new trend considering journalists as qualified applicants with a view to better exercise their duties in terms of freedom of expression. So do not consider as granted a restrictive approach where if the agency decides to move to the option of access to document, that journalists are necessarily as such outside of the list of possible applicants. My final remark comes to the preliminary recommendation from Guido Rasi. We are here just to speak about clinical trials. We do not speak about the draft regulation, of course. But in the mid-long term, there is also need to ensure consistency between the two approaches. And I'm not dealing now with details, but if we'll have a look to certain provisions of the draft regulation concerning the EU portal and certain databases, there is an approach on openness. And I think your test is to be conducted by also paying attention to what happens in a wider perspective.
So coming back to Francois after that, you've heard sort of two slightly different sets of arguments. You've heard the arguments from a journal and a scientist perspective that actually it wouldn't be wise to restrict the access for secondary analysis, and you've heard a data protection view coming at it from a slightly different perspective. Is your mind made up on this, or?
I briefly mentioned the access to the safety, to the reports, the adverse drug reaction reports, particularly the spontaneous reports. They are collected in a database, and the public has access to the aggregated data contained in that database. If you want to have access to the raw data, to the individual data, then you have to explain who you are, to propose a kind of research protocol, and then the agency will grant you access to that data. Here, for clinical trial data, we would feel comfortable with a similar approach, where those who want to have access to the data submit a proposal to the agency, and depending or to another independent body who will grant them data. I think that would be safer in the consent form to inform the patients, the trial participants, that instead of releasing the data to anybody for any kind of analysis, only those which are qualified according to some criteria. And there are recommendations that already exist, like, for example, the International Society of Pharmacoepidemiology has recommendations on data privacy, medical record confidentiality, and research in the interest of public health. We have reviewed these criteria, and we think they are perfectly sound.
Ben, you have been a strong critic of badly done science in general. You could interpret some of your remarks as being that you don't take that view with respect to bad secondary analysis.
Well, I don't think that bad secondary analyses are any more likely than bad primary analyses by the trialists themselves. And I think that the problem of bad analysis is best solved by requiring fully published protocols and analytic strategies from everybody before they start. That's how to catch bad analyses.
And what would your position be on peer review of secondary analyses?
Well, I think peer review is actually a very imperfect way of policing the literature. And more than that, I don't think that journals are necessarily the most appropriate place to communicate the results of clinical trials. The lesson of Tamiflu, for example, has been very clearly that there were serious discrepancies between the contents of journal publications and the contents of the clinical study reports.
So you would simply let it all out there, would you?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I think we should discount anybody who does a secondary analysis who doesn't pre-specify their protocol beforehand, I think we should regard them as data dredgers. But I think we should regard industry or independent academic researchers who don't pre-specify their own protocol for their own analysis of their own trial as data dredgers, if they don't make their analysis plan publicly available before they begin.
So, Virginia Barbour, you would abandon peer review, would you?
Well, I think there is a good argument to be made that clinical trials are very imperfectly published in journals. I'm not the first person to say that. Many editors have said it before me. Clinical trial journal publications are just one part of a sort of a whole ecosystem of things that come out of clinical trials. I think that they have a place, but the fact that they are now considered the only report that gets incorporated into systematic reviews, meta-analyses, patient guidelines, etc., is hugely problematic. And I think it's a function of the fact that in the past that we've not had better ways of doing things. We do have better ways of doing things, and I think that they will still have some role. I absolutely agree that any analyses that come out of the data that's released under initiatives like this has to be published somewhere. I don't think it does have to be in journals, but I think we have to come up with a good, robust mechanism for getting it out there publicly available. You know, we've learnt very clearly that one of the best ways of getting peer review of articles is after they're published. And I think that's why I emphasised when I talked that however these results get out there, they also have to be in a way so that people can look at them completely openly.
I'm sort of slightly struggling with myself to find if there's anything that I can get the whole panel to agree on. And so let me try this, which is that, do you all agree that it is possible to do harm through the publication of things that receive wide public attention, where either taking or not taking a drug could end up with causing harm to a population? I mean, do you agree that there is the potential for a report of a clinical study to do harm to a population? Does everyone agree with that or not? Yes.
Do you agree?
Yeah. So I think the challenge to the panel is, how do we minimize the chances of that happening? And in a sense, there's two proposals that are sort of slightly running counter to each other. One is that we deal with the clinical trials as they're published, and the other is that we just let everything out there. But I suppose my challenge to each of you in turn, and maybe you should each have a go, is to say, how are we going to minimize the potential of harm to a population from data that is wrong or misinterpreted getting out there? Peter.
Well, I think you know what I'm going to say. I will support Ginny and Ben, of course, that primary publication are by and large pretty unreliable. Systematic reviews have shown that again and again and again, and it has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And I don't need to mention all the scandal you all know about. So we need to be much more open about this. It's very simple.
Susan.
Well, certainly I like some of the ideas that have been suggested, and I think that what we've discussed inside the industry is that if a third party is going to do an analysis, that some good practice analysis be implemented. And for instance, some of the ideas here, that you would post your proposed analysis on some portal, you leave it there for 2 weeks, you allow anybody who's interested to make some sort of comments, and you would adjust your analysis as a result, and then you do your analysis and then you would post it. I think that to some extent that would minimize the harm. The other thing that I would say is that Dr. Barbour and Dr. Gøtzsche both mentioned, the cave somewhere in Sweden, which is full of data, and what we want it all electronic on PDF files. I don't think that all electronic on PDF files actually solves the problem either, because then you've got an electronic cave somewhere in Sweden. And I have to say, on behalf of the industry, we're on a journey, and we recognise that we need to better meet the transparency needs. And certainly in some cases, what I would recommend these days in the first instance is that the person who wants to do an analysis should approach the company directly. And I think that then, they post it that they've approached the company, and then the company takes their independent peer group to review it. And that way, to be honest, I think you're going to get the best data set, because you're going to get it directly from the company. It's going to be the most up to date. Whatever you submit to the EMA in the end, it's only a question of some time, some additional submission, and it's not going to have been the best data set. And you're going to be in your electronic PDF files trying to work out if you've got the best PDF file or not.
Okay, I suppose I would debate if I was the EMA, if I was being told I wasn't being given the best data set. But
As at the time you're being given
Right.
it, but then when the requester comes in a year or two later, then maybe what you've got, and then it becomes an eternal thing of replacing data sets.
Okay, so that was helpful, and actually I want to move in the next phase of discussion to getting positive suggestions from the panel about how this should be implemented. And Susan made a good one about a portal, post what the analysis is. So some practical suggestions. Neil, how are we going to minimise harm and maximise value?
So I think when you look at the challenges we face, there is potential to do harm almost everywhere.
Yeah.
There's potential to do harm by not sharing enough information, and there's potential to do harm by sharing too much information. I think one example, which I perhaps touched on when I was doing my introduction, is that the industry generally, I think, would like to see us do many more collaborative studies in the first instance, so that when we are collecting data, we're doing so in a manner that is in a collaborative context, so that data intrinsically starts out in a much broader group, so that there is no, and it's very clear to me from perhaps I wasn't quite as aware of it as I might have been sitting on the panel, the sort of intensity of the feeling and the concern that the interpretation is actually very isolated within industry. I think we're moving more to do some of our studies, particularly when we're actually doing a really far-reaching and breaking into new targets, to do those in collaboration with a broader group of academic colleagues. And I think that intrinsically starts off with a much broader group looking at the data.
But then would you accompany that by making the data more open for others to analyse?
Well, I think it is becoming more openly, and I guess what we are saying here is that we do have concerns about Ben's proposal that you put it all out there, and there may ultimately be some very good analysis, and there may be some poor analysis, and so be it. I mean, the reality is we have concerns about that approach, and that's not in any way to be. I think it's very clear that patients are a critical component of the thinking, not just in terms of our perhaps highly scientific endpoints, but just what it means to them. And it's very clear that certainly the patient groups that we've worked with are actually very well informed about their, but of course that's perhaps not representative of everybody. And I think there is that potential to do harm when you actually perhaps make different interpretations available broadly to everybody who perhaps doesn't have the benefit of the insight of what is good and what is not good data analysis or good science.
So Ben, how are people going to see through the cacophony of noise?
Well, Neil is concerned about the theoretical, imaginable risk of bad quality analyses in the future if they share their data. But we have an ongoing reality right now of bad quality analyses by industry of their own data, by academics of their own data. And I think the way to fix this is very simply by having a level playing field for everybody conducting an analysis on the data produced in the conduct of a clinical trial. You require that people post their protocols in public, and you require that people share their data publicly. And then everybody can cross-check everybody else's work. And when we see that industry does a flawed analysis of their own data, we can identify that very early on. And when people see that secondary analyses are done that are poor, then they can question those. I mean, we have to remember that the academic literature is a buyer beware professional literature. People do not robotically follow the odds ratios reported in whatever clinical trial report is shoved underneath their nose. They critically appraise the results of those studies before they put them into practice, and rightly so. So I think we fix this by making sure that primary and secondary data analyses are both conducted transparently and as properly as possible.
Okay, thank you. Virginia, minimise harm.
Okay, well, just to clarify, I didn't say we wanted PDF files. I think in a cave or otherwise. I mean, I think that we've moved well beyond the time of PDF being the way to share data. So, we need to use sort of the smart tools that are out there, the smart ways of tagging data. So let's just kind of get away from PDFs if we can. I also think, I know we're trying to be pragmatic here, but I actually just want to kind of reiterate what I think we've agreed, which is that this data release is going to happen. We're not here to discuss whether or not it is going to happen or whether or not it's going to be released by the companies. It is going to be required by EMA if they license a drug. Am I correct?
Yes.
Right. So I think that given that, we need to debate how that's going to happen. And, if we want a way to underpin that, I think the real point is that if you want a drug to be marketed, you have got to provide the evidence that shows us it is appropriate to be on the market. And that's what this is about at its bottom. I don't like the idea that some people are not smart enough to understand the evidence or the data that's out there. I think that time and time again, we've just shown that by sharing data, by sharing analyses, people do much smarter things than the original investigators ever thought of, and that's the democratization of data that I think we want to see. I do think we need to have clear ideas about how we share it and what the practical bits and pieces around it are. But I think the fundamental underlying principles has to be that this is a good thing to do and we need to work out the practicalities.
François.
Whenever a colleague or another association is conducting a survey and then publishes the results, and there is something which sounds like in the results, and I ask access to the data and do my own analysis of the results, if I find something different from what they found, the first thing I do is not go public, is go back to them and say, let's discuss why we have a difference here. And I think that is a model that could be applied. The EMA will soon have public hearings on safety issues, considering the context of the therapeutic benefit of the product. So we're almost there, where there will be private or public arena where different results can be confronted before they reach the public too far. As I said, there are risks of confusion in the public and miscommunication, and when this is done, well, it's done. But the idea of confronting different analyses, different results, before going too far publicly, I think is something that should be followed, with having in mind permanently the risk of disclosure of information that can identify the patients. And we never know which information. It's not only the demographics. If I mention a family in Estonia with one metabolic disease who talked to me and complained about the healthcare system, if you are from the Estonia, you already know enough to know exactly who I was talking about, because there are only 9 patients of that disease and only one parent can speak English, so she is probably the person who talked to me. And I didn't have the intention of making that person identifiable, but it's so easy to release some information that some will use to identify the patients. And if we have to delete the ethnicity, the gender, the age, the country of residence, the co-medications, because with the co-medications you can know in which country the person is living depending on where the drugs are available, what is left? So on the contrary of releasing all the information public, I think it's important to frame and to discuss on a case-by-case what from the data set can be released, and more importantly, to confront the results when they diverge.
But François, before you talked about the family that had lost 2 children from a rare disease and their desire to maximize the research impact. So balance that with what you've just said.
And you're putting me under trouble because it's really difficult to... It's 2 realities, they exist. There are some patients willing to take the risk of breaching their data and transmitting data, even if some are really confidential and important to protect. Others who are really put at risk when this information is disclosed.
And whose reality trumped, whose views trump whose in this situation?
Whose views
trump whose? Who should have priority? You say that you want everything to be done I say I want my absolute privacy. Who wins, you or me?
The problem when privacy is breached, it's done, and then you cannot recall the information. It's released and it's released, and any harm which is done is done.
But I mean, I think we probably shouldn't get stuck on this one for too long. But I mean, there clearly is an issue of privacy and personal sensitive information. And I think there must be a consensus that says that any data release has got to maximize the privacy of the participants. So, Giovanni, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, with an additional comment concerning the notion of personal data. I think it's clear from my position today that there is no need to work on this notion, to have a restrictive interpretation, to have changes in the regulation or in the new regulation to be applied to member states with a view to ensure openness. In this sense, you encourage us to introduce some spicy comments. So let me now be a little bit in disagreement with the Ombudsman. I think we should be greatly grateful to the Ombudsman for what they did in 2010. If you see the decision 2560, the decision is largely, not only, but largely focusing on a conclusion which is now shared by all. So these informations are not commercially confidential and as such. So openness should prevail. But there is a paragraph of the decision dealing with the notion of personal data. And again, there are some very good comments from the Ombudsman by quoting the relevant provisions to be applied where they distinguish identified individuals and identifiable individuals. They also pay attention to, the means to be used to directly or indirectly identify the same individuals. There is just one detail, and frequently the daily is into detail, which attracted my attention. It seems that they are saying that at the very end, since in the documents which are disclosed, there is no link which will directly allows the identification of people which are not mentioned by name in that case. So there is no personal data, and then the conclusion from the agency was wrong. I think that the approach of the data protection community is entirely different. It's not a question of interpretation, it's simply a different analysis of the legal system. Our viewpoint is that although the missing piece of information, which is crucial to identify the very end individual, is not in the possession of the applicant, but perhaps is only in the possession of the agency of a third party, the information remains personal data because someone around the world may identify the data. And so it is less crucial to identify who is in possess of the necessary link. But again, this is irrelevant for the conclusions to be made. I think it's important not to adopt a restrictive notion of personal data with a view to not restrict data subject rights. And I think in that perspective it's also crucial for you to know what the trends are at the European level about the other regulation, the general one, which is under discussion, because now we are in a historical moment for data protection. There is a data protection package to be applied horizontally to all member states and to all the private and public entities, including law enforcement bodies. In a second step, soon, the Regulation 45 to be applied to EU institutions and bodies, including agency, will be adjusted accordingly. What the trends are, if you pay attention to the European Parliament website, you will find a link to documents adopted by the LIBE committee. There are 3 working documents distributed on the 9th of October. by the two rapporteurs, and particularly those related to the regulation, coming from Jan Albrecht, rapporteur, speaking also on behalf of shadow rapporteurs. They clearly say there is a unanimous position in the Parliament to keep the current definition of personal data. And this is a message not only to pharmaceutical industry, but also to providers, internet providers, because the discussion is mainly on the issue of internet protocol addresses. But at the same time, they say, we understand that perhaps a separate trend is to be discussed in terms of policy with regard to cases where individuals are, legally speaking, identifiable by a legal point of view, but there is no intention, or is more difficult to identify the same people. So perhaps we may work in a perspective to have a simplified framework in terms of legal obligations, in terms of adjustments to be made. I think this is a crucial trend to be considered in the midterm.
We could have a very good seminar on this topic alone, and indeed I think sometime it would be a good thing to do. But I suppose one question to you is that identifiability, there's two parts to that. There's whether the information itself is potentially identifiable and the context in which the information is looked at. And the context means that whilst my date of birth might identify me in one environment, it might not in another.
Anyway, I balanced my comment with a lot of appreciation.
Yeah. But let's move back to the panel, because I was giving them a little rest deliberately. I want to have one more round, and I think we probably... Can someone tell me whether we can break for tea 5 minutes or so early? Because I think that what I want to do is we're going to have a tea break, and then after that we're going to have plenary discussion. So I hope you've all got... there's plenty of you here, so plenty of opportunity to ask questions. But in the spirit that, as someone has said, this is going to happen, and therefore we need the practical suggestions. Let's just have some more practical suggestions from the panel as to how we're going to make this happen. And there's been a little bit of a debate about a cave containing PDF files or anything else. What is going to be the best way to implement this? So more practical suggestions. Susan's given us one, so we'll spare her initially. Neil.
Thank you.
He's going to get me afterwards.
I mean, I think the general concept of making data that is going to be beneficial to patients accessible to better interpretation is a very positive one, and I think we're supportive. I think actually what Ben described is to ensure that any such interpretation or access is actually based on the basis with an upfront explanation of what it is intended to do with that, and the analysis is intended to be done. I think it would be a very good idea.
Okay, Peter.
Well, let me refer on my little experiences from the British Medical Journal that has asked for a couple of years whether we will make data available when we publish there. And we have done that, and that's not a great deal to do that. That was not randomized trials, but it was other sorts of data. And Andrew Wickers from the States, for example, have also done this and says it's not a big deal, just provide the data and let other people use them. So I can't see immense practical problems here. That's maybe my fault.
You can't see just a bottomless pit of data which actually can't be turned into information. People tend sometimes to equate data and information, and sometimes they confuse information and knowledge. Yes,
of course. But you don't start looking at trial data unless you have a purpose. So I don't think it would happen so much as some people think in this panel, because it takes a lot of time. But in the Cochrane collaboration, we are around 30,000 people. So there would, of course, be a good deal of people who would like to see the raw data in order to produce more reliable Cochrane reviews. So, Of course, data are useless if they are just data, but that's not the idea.
Okay. And do you think people should need to declare their purpose before they have access to data?
No, actually not. I favor a very simple model where data are just available, because as soon as you start to introducing obstacles, it will lead to arbitrariness, it will lead to delays, and who will make decisions and all that sort of thing. Just make it available and let people use them. We also know from PLOS medicine that has required people to say that, yes, we will offer the data if anybody asks for them. And then I think it was Andrew Vickers also who asked for data from 10 trials, and he only got data from 2 trials. So as soon as you have a human element, you are asking for disaster. You should just make them available. That's it. All experience we have tell us this.
Susan, come back to you. Just make it available.
Well, I'm terribly worried about that idea, as you can imagine. I mean, if you just make it available and somebody decides that there will be an appropriate analysis, and in particular, I think that, if you take a product which is relatively early in the life cycle, I think, and it were to be picked up big time by the media, and let's face it, on the whole, the media stories about drugs are not very good stories, because that makes more news. So that then gets picked up, really upsets lots of people, upsets lots of doctors who don't know what to do. They all stop prescribing it, and actually it might have been a fantastic product. So I am very concerned that if we're going to have additional analysis, these should be somehow prospectively defined, and they should be reviewed, and people should have an opportunity to comment. I don't see that's necessarily a good thing just to put it out there and everybody look until they find something interesting.
But Susan, when you say early in the life cycle, this is post-authorization, so it's not that early in the life cycle.
Well, it's jolly early in the life cycle, I think, with respect to making it available to patients.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Ben?
Well, as you know, because I've said it about 1,000 times now, I think we should post all protocols and make them publicly available. I think we have to remember that there is a serious problem of misleading analyses already by industry on their own trials. And so this is an existing problem that needs to be addressed.
You're being very selective in your criticism, if I may say so. Do you not think academics do misleading analyses as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I put that caveat in the first 3 times I said the same thing.
Okay, well, you better keep
I thought it was heard, but I'll keep saying it over and again. The only thing I would say is I would perhaps at worst be happy with a 2-tier system. So, for example, Susan Forder from FBA wants industry to control access to their better, newer data sets. Well, I don't see anything wrong with the EMA hosting the data that was given to them. And then if people also want to apply for the better, newer data sets directly from a company, then that would be fine. And similarly, if there are concerns about very, very rich individual identifiable or potentially de-anonymizable patient data, then you could potentially have 2 tiers there. You could have a more stripped down form of the data that was universally publicly available, and then a richer data set where people have to go through the same kind of processes that you go through to get access to the very rich identifying information in GPRD. But I would say, because Peter's right to raise concerns about transparency, arbitrariness and slowness in that process, that it would have to be fast and it would have to be fully transparent. So everybody's requests and everybody's objections would have to be posted in public immediately.
Okay, Virginia.
Okay, so in the spirit of trying to come up with practical things that we can do, I think it's fairly clear from the discussion on this panel that we need to come up with incentives for drug companies to do this, because it's not going down terribly well at the moment, it seems to me. So that needs to be something to work on. And then I think what we clearly need to do whatever we can to plant the data at the centre of all the information around trials. Right now, trial reports are the things that are out there in the public domain. The data are not available. So we are basically basing a lot of evidence, a lot of our clinical decisions on secondary data, secondary information. And I think we have to move away from that. So the things that I would say that move that forward quickest are that we have the data in a format that it can be used. We have to move to open data formats, away from the PDFs into something that's usable. Take the humans out of the business of reading it. They have to have licenses which tell machines that they can read this stuff as well and what they can do with it. So both licenses for the data itself and for the secondary publications. And we need to have really, really good metadata and curation of these data, because that's where I think a lot of the that's where it will fall down. If we basically dump data in an unusable format, we won't be much further forward.
François, last comment before tea.
I was thinking at the procedure, the regulatory procedure as it is today and as it will evolve tomorrow, with different milestones where some information will add to the previous set of information. And already there are opportunities to have external experts invited to this assessment. It's protocol assistance, it's scientific advice. It will open to HTA experts. And maybe this is also where those who would be interested to have a second look or to verify or to see what the data are actually saying could maybe have a word to say as a start, rather than releasing all the information to whoever wants to analyze it.
Okay, Neil, last point before tea.
Thank you. I just, I guess I'd like to make one point which talks to perhaps, I have the impression that this is viewed as actually very simple to do, to share in a searchable manner. And I think that might not be the case. And I suppose two questions really perhaps for us to think about over tea. One is, who bears the cost of actually ensuring that this data is interpretable and accessible? And secondly, I mean, I think what we've seen is, I think many of us have had discussions that there are many sources of data, and one of them being the generalized patient data, the population patient data, when people present what they're treated with, how they respond to that actually would be hugely beneficial for patients as a whole. It would be beneficial to academics, it would be beneficial actually to the economies of people who are trying to control the costs, it would be beneficial to drug companies. And we've talked positively about making that data available, but so far, in practical terms, I think we've not been able to do it. And I think that just talks to the fact that data is not, even though that may be available and it may be in PDF, the translation of it into searchable form is not trivial, and it will be a not trivial cost.
What I want you to do is, I'm sure you've had plenty of time to think of questions already. What I don't want to do is just, as it were, to pursue the same discussion we've had before tea endlessly. So if people can try and think and bring up new topics, new areas, most of all, practical suggestions. Can I thank all the panelists because they've been working very hard, and thank our presenters initially.